So hello and welcome to this session in which we will explore an aspect of Jesus' leadership style that's generally overlooked. I'm going to speak for a little while about his humility. One of the things you'll notice about the teaching of Jesus is that he often challenged the status quo and taught things that were countercultural, turning society's norms upside down. Like most cultures, first century culture demanded that leaders would be strong and powerful. It was acceptable for them to be ego-driven and proud. But Jesus' model of leadership demonstrated something totally different. When the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Philippi about the mindset of Jesus as Jesus approached both his life and leadership, as well as his painful death, Paul wrote, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Jesus' life was marked not by arrogance, but by humility. A number of years ago now, I read a story of a bicycle race in India where the object of the race was to go the shortest distance in the time specified. All the racers lined up at the start line, and as the gun sounded, they tried to stand still. Racers were disqualified if they put a foot down, so they would inch forward just enough to keep the bike balanced. When the final gun sounded, the person who had travelled the furthest lost, and the person who was closest to the start line was the winner. Imagine participating in that race, but no one had told you the rules. When the race starts, you naturally pedal as fast as you can. You get out of breath, you break into a sweat, you're the first over the finish line. You've broken the record. At least that's what you think. And then somebody steps in and they tell you the rules. And you discover that actually you're the worst ever loser only because you misunderstood how the race operated. You know, the New Testament often depicts our Christian lives in terms of a race. But the rules of our race are often in direct contrast to the rules of our culture's race. So our prevailing secular culture tells us to run towards comfort and power and position and pleasure. Our culture tells us that it's actually okay to be selfish and to step on people and to hurt people as long as you get to the finish line first. Whereas, of course, the Bible tells us to run towards a finish line that is beyond this life, which is in front of the very throne room of God. And the winning strategy is based on humility and service and sacrifice and selflessness. A little while ago, I read a Christian leadership book where the author wrote about something he called the pecking order. He said that if you took 10 chickens and put them in a pen together and then scatter some seed, within just a few minutes, those chickens who were previously strangers will have formed a hierarchy based on their dominance. Through a series of skirmishes, a decision will be made with regards to who's the number 1 chicken, right through who is to the number 10 chicken. From then on, number 1 chicken is treated with respect, and number 10 chicken has a miserable life. It'd be tempting to think that this is something that only happens with chickens, but this kind of thing happens everywhere. It happens in workplaces, at sporting events, at family occasions, at social occasions, even with gatherings of church leaders. Church leaders will often ask other church leaders certain questions that will help them determine where they fit on the pecking order. They will ask other leaders how many people attend their churches, how big their budget is, how many they have on their staff team. As church leaders, we are tempted to compete to become bigger and better and faster and stronger and more important and more successful than everyone else. And if we happen to tread on a few people to achieve our goals, we secretly believe that's okay. But the Bible tells us to run a different race, to run as servants, to be selfless. Even when it feels like it's counterintuitive, we are called to lead with humility. Recently, I was reading a book by a historian, John Dixon, who wrote the book called Humilitas. In that book, he makes a bold statement. He says that the most influential and inspiring people are often marked by humility, which raises a question, is that correct? Is it really true that the most influential people in the world aren't brash or arrogant or powerful or self-centered or ego-driven, but rather the greatest leaders are humble? Is that really true? Back in 2001, Jim Collins, a renowned researcher, he published a book called Good to Great, which analysed the leadership styles of those who were leading America's most successful companies. His detailed 5-year-long research project discovered something quite unusual but significant. He found that the most effective leaders were modest, self-effacing, understated, gracious, and humble. Collins said his research cut against the grain of conventional wisdom and concluded that humility should be the most sought-after quality when any person is selected for a leadership role. As I read Jim Collins' findings, I did start to wonder whether he was actually just rediscovering something that the Bible has been teaching us for many centuries, that Christ-like humility is an essential attribute for the Christian leader. You know, the culture of Jesus' day was dominated by the Greeks and the Romans, who both upheld an honor-shame culture. In those days, people did everything they could to receive public honor and avoid public shame. And because of this, humility was a virtue to be avoided. It was actually considered to be shameful unless you were humbling yourself before the emperor or before your gods. It was considered to be shameful if you humbled yourself before a peer or before somebody of a lower standing in the pecking order. And so the Greeks and the Romans would often boast and congratulate themselves and praise one another in public. It was considered normal. In fact, Plutarch, a first-century Greek historian and Roman citizen, compiled a work and he entitled it, How to Praise Yourself Inoffensively. And then Jesus arrives on the scene. Historians like John Dixon suggest that one of the primary impacts that Jesus had on the world was that he taught that humility was a quality to be admired, even one to be copied. In an ego-dominated culture of arrogance and boasting, Jesus came to teach and demonstrate a different form of leadership that prized humility and servanthood. In fact, there's an interesting contrast in the early gospel narratives between the differing leadership styles of Herod and Jesus. Herod, who was so highly regarded by the Romans that they gave him the title King of the Jews, ruled ruthlessly. He abused his power, he oppressed the weak, he used violence to achieve his goals. The only other person to be given the title King of the Jews was Jesus, when a sign was fixed to the wooden cross on which he would die. And so when the paths of Herod and Jesus intersected, Herod was an insecure leader, violently clinging on to power, while at the same time Jesus entered the world as a weak, powerless infant, and he would grow up demonstrating a kingship totally different to Herod's. It was one of servitude, sacrifice, and humility. Central to Jesus' understanding of humility, at least within a leadership context, are his words that we find in Matthew 20, 25 to 28. Jesus said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." You know, there are some who suggest that the establishment of humility as an essential quality for Christian leadership is not just derived from Jesus' teaching, but also from his death, and specifically the method of his execution. In an honour-shame culture, where honour was proof of one's personal value and shame was proof of one's worthlessness, Jesus' death on a Roman cross was considered to be the most shameful way to die, reserved for rebels and slaves. And so as Jesus' followers witnessed the greatest man they'd ever known experience death by crucifixion, they arrived at this new understanding of greatness and leadership. They found that leadership can express itself in humility through the dignified decision to lower oneself for the sake of others. Jesus, through his life, his teaching, and then his death, demonstrated a leadership model that was unpretentious and humble. Humility is a Jesus idea. And so the first datable reference to this radical understanding of Jesus' leadership and humility is found in Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. Paul urges his readers, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. He says that their attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Within decades of Paul writing those instructions, humility was firmly established as a virtue for life and leadership within the Christian church. And within a few centuries, it was also recognized in the wider world that this formerly negative characteristic of humility was now something to be revered and admired. You may know that Paul not only wrote inspiring words about the virtue of humility and the example of Christ, but he also followed closely in the steps of Jesus, leading with humility, leading with a modest self-appraisal. He balanced his leadership role and title as an apostle and a founding father with his self-description as a slave and as a servant. So let's take a few minutes to discuss this theme. And as you respond to the questions in your booklets, you might just want to think about how you would define humility. What's the difference between false humility and real humility? How would you differentiate between low self-esteem and humility? And whether it's actually ever right to be ambitious and humble. So let's pause and let's take a break.